Before you transfer me, I need to see Annie, the little girl who saved my life. The sentence broke apart as it left Jonathan Hale's lips, thin and breathless, as if his heart could no longer support a full thought. His chest rose unevenly beneath the hospital blanket. One hand lay motionless at his side. The other trembled faintly, fingers twitching as though reaching for something only he could see. Margaret froze. "Annie?" she asked, panic cutting through her voice. "Jonathan, who is Annie?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, unfocused, then slowly back to her face. The effort alone seemed to drain what little strength he had left. "I'm not confused," he whispered. "Please, listen." Margaret leaned closer, her hand tightening around his. "I am listening, but you're scaring me." Jonathan swallowed. His throat moved with difficulty. Then, with a faint nod toward the bedside table, he murmured, "My wallet." "H.C." Margaret followed his gaze. "What about it?" "Open it," he said. "Please." She hesitated only a second before picking it up. It felt heavier than it should have, worn soft at the edges from years of use. As she unfolded it, a small photograph slipped into her palm. Margaret looked down. It was a picture of a little black girl, smiling shyly at the camera, her hair pulled back, her eyes wide and alert. She looked impossibly young. At the bottom of the photo, written in uneven, childish handwriting, were the words, "Annie, 5 years old." Margaret's breath caught. "Jonathan," she said slowly, "why do you have a picture of a child?" His fingers twitched, reaching toward the photo even as his strength failed him. "Because, a year ago, that child refused to let me die." She looked up at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "I was walking," he said, his voice barely audible now. "Just walking. On the sidewalk. No guards, no driver. I thought I was fine." His grip tightened weakly around her hand. Then the pain came. All at once. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Margaret didn't interrupt. She could see it now, the memory pulling him backward, away from the hospital room. "She was there," Jonathan continued. "So small, too small to understand what was happening. But she didn't run. She started yelling, pulling at people. She wouldn't stop until someone helped." His eyes closed for a moment. "When I woke up, I was in a public hospital, and she was holding my hand, like she thought if she let go, I might disappear." Margaret stared at the photograph again, her hands shaking. "You never told me this." "I couldn't," he said softly. "By the time you got there, she was gone." He opened his eyes and looked straight at her. "She gave me that photo before she left. She didn't ask for anything. She just gave it to me." The room fell quiet. One of the doctors cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale," he said gently, "you're scheduled to be transferred in 3 days. The private facility is prepared to intervene immediately. Delaying that could be dangerous." Jonathan turned his head slightly. "Doctor," he whispered, "if I survive the surgery, but leave this unfinished, then what kind of life am I recovering for?" Margaret shook her head, overwhelmed. "We don't even know who she is," she said, "or where she lives." "I know," Jonathan replied. "That's why I'm asking. If there's any chance at all, I need to see her." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Please." Margaret looked around the room at the doctors, the nurses, the quiet urgency on their faces. Then she looked back at the man she had built her life with. For the first time in years, she saw no trace of the authority or certainty that usually defined him. Only need. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll try." The doctor frowned. "Mrs. Hale, we'll try," Margaret repeated, firmer this time. "He's asking for one thing." That night, the family moved quickly. By morning, Jonathan Hale's face appeared on every major local news station. The story was simple, almost disarming. A billionaire searching for the little girl who once saved his life. A photo of Annie filled the screen. A number scrolled beneath it. Viewers were asked to call if they recognized her. Jonathan watched the television from his hospital bed, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on the screen. "She'd be 6 now," he murmured. "She might not even remember me." Margaret sat beside him. "Children remember more than we think," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Hours passed, then a day. Jonathan grew weaker. The doctors exchanged worried looks. The transfer date loomed closer. On the second evening, just as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Jonathan drifted in and out of sleep. His hand still clutched the edge of the blanket, the photo tucked safely beneath it. The door opened softly. Margaret looked up, expecting a nurse. Instead, she froze. A young woman stood hesitantly in the doorway, holding the hand of a little girl. The girl's hair was tied back neatly. She wore a simple jacket that was slightly too big for her small frame. Her eyes scanned the room with quiet curiosity. The girl took a step forward. Jonathan stirred. His eyes opened slowly. At first, they didn't focus. Then his gaze landed on the child standing a few feet away from his bed. Time seemed to stop. The little girl looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Hi," she said. "I'm Annie." Jonathan's breath caught sharply. His eyes widened, filling instantly with tears. "You," he whispered. "You came." "Okay." Annie nodded. "My mom saw you on TV, she said. She said you were looking for me." Jonathan tried to sit up, failed, then reached out with trembling hands. "I never forgot you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not for one day." Annie stepped closer, her small fingers slipping into his. "I remember you," she said simply, and in that moment, surrounded by machines and whispered prayers, Jonathan Hale understood something he had never learned in boardrooms or courtrooms or operating rooms. Some debts could never be repaid. They could only be honored. The room did not move for several seconds after Annie spoke her name. Jonathan Hale's fingers closed weakly around the small hand resting in his. Her skin was warm. Real. Not a memory. Not a hallucination pulled from the edge of his failing heart. His chest tightened, but this time the pain was different. It wasn't the sharp warning that had brought him here. It was something heavier, slower, filled with emotion he had spent a lifetime keeping at bay. You seem taller, he said, managing a faint, broken smile through the tears gathering in his eyes. Annie tilted her head, studying him with the same serious focus she must have used a year earlier when she refused to leave him on the sidewalk. "My mom says I'm growing fast," she replied. Margaret stood frozen near the foot of the bed, one hand pressed to her mouth. She had watched her husband command boardrooms, negotiate billion-dollar deals without flinching, walk away from conflicts that left other men shaking. She had never seen him like this, never seen him undone by something so small and so human. Annie's mother stepped forward cautiously. She was in her early 30s, her posture polite but guarded, the posture of someone who had learned long ago to be careful in unfamiliar spaces. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, "I'm sorry to just show up like this." "We saw the news." Annie recognized the picture right away. Jonathan looked up at her, still holding Annie's hand as if letting go might undo the moment. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You brought me more than I ever expected." The doctors lingered near the door, uncertain. One of them glanced at Margaret, silently asking whether this visit should be shortened. Margaret shook her head almost imperceptibly. For once, schedules and protocols felt smaller than what was unfolding in front of them. "I didn't think you'd come," Jonathan admitted, his voice low. "I was afraid. Maybe life had already taken you somewhere else." Annie shrugged. "We moved," she said simply. "Just across town." Across town. The words struck Jonathan harder than any diagnosis. Entire worlds could exist only miles apart and never touch. A year ago, his world had brushed against hers for a few minutes on a cracked sidewalk, and that brief contact had saved his life. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I didn't know how before. I didn't know if I ever would." Annie squeezed his fingers once, gently. "You don't have to," she said. "My mom says helping people is just what you do." Her mother smiled faintly, though there was a weariness behind it. "We didn't expect anything," she added. "When Annie told me she saw you on TV, I wasn't sure it was real, but she remembered you. She remembered the hospital, the beeping noises." Jonathan nodded. "I remember you leaving," he said to Annie. "I wanted to stop you. I wanted to say something, but my body wouldn't listen." "That's okay," Annie replied. "You were sick." Such a simple explanation, offered without judgment. Margaret finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said, stepping closer, "for saving my husband." "I was nowed." Annie looked at her, puzzled. I just yelled, she said. Other people helped. Margaret knelt slightly so they were closer to eye level. Sometimes yelling is what makes people stop and pay attention. Annie considered this, then nodded as if filing the thought away. Jonathan's breathing grew heavier, and a nurse moved closer, checking his monitors. He waved her off gently. Just a minute, he murmured. Please. The nurse hesitated, then stepped back, though her eyes never left him. There's something you should know, Jonathan said to Annie's mother. After that day, I tried to find you. I asked the hospital. No one had your name. She nodded. We don't usually leave much of a trail, she said. We went home after that. Annie talked about you for a few days. Then life went on. Life went on. For Jonathan, life had slowed into a constant awareness of how close he had come to losing everything. For Annie, it had simply continued forward, as it always did. I kept the picture, he said quietly. It reminded me that I was still here for a reason. Annie glanced at the bedside table where the worn photo lay. That's my favorite picture, she said. I was mad that day because my tooth fell out. Jonathan let out a soft, surprised laugh, which quickly turned into a cough. The nurse stepped in again, firmer this time. Mr. Hale, you need to rest. I know, he said. I just didn't want this moment to end without saying one thing. I see. He turned his head fully toward Annie, his expression suddenly serious. You saved my life, he said. Not just my heart, my life. If this moment touched your heart even a little, take a second to let us know. Please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments where you are watching, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss stories that remind us why kindness still matters. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Annie watched him, unblinking. Are you going to be okay? She asked. The question hung in the air. Jonathan glanced briefly at Margaret, then back at Annie. The doctors think I can be, he said. I'm going to another hospital soon. They're going to fix my heart. Good, Annie said, because it didn't sound good on TV. Margaret smiled despite herself. No, she agreed. It didn't. Annie's mother shifted her weight, sensing the visit was nearing its end. We should probably let you rest, she said gently. Jonathan nodded, though the thought clearly pained him. Before you go, he said, there's something I want you to promise me. Annie frowned slightly. What? Keep doing what you did that day, he said. Pay attention. Speak up. Don't ever think you're too small to matter. Annie looked at her mother, then back at him. Okay, she said. Margaret stood as Annie and her mother turned toward the door. At the threshold, Annie stopped and looked back. Mr. Hale, she said. Yes, he replied. You didn't forget, she said. No, he said softly. I didn't. After they left, the room felt quieter, but lighter somehow. Jonathan closed his eyes, his breathing steadier than it had been all day. Margaret sat beside him and took his hand. You found her, she said. No, he replied. She found me. Outside the room, the doctors resumed their quiet discussion. The transfer was still necessary. The risks were still real, but something had changed. Jonathan Hale was no longer holding on just to survive. He was holding on with purpose. Morning arrived quietly in the public hospital, without ceremony or softness. Jonathan Hale woke to the low hum of machines and the distant sound of carts rolling down the corridor. Pale daylight filtered through the narrow window, landing across the foot of his bed. For a few seconds, he lay still, unsure whether the night before had been real or only a dream shaped by exhaustion and fear. Then he felt the ache in his chest. The familiar pressure reminded him where he was. He turned his head slightly. The chair beside his bed was empty now, neatly pushed back under the wall. Annie was gone. Her mother was gone. Yet something in the room felt different, as if the air itself carried a residue of warmth. You're awake, Margaret said softly. He hadn't heard her enter. She stood near the window, holding a paper cup of hospital coffee, untouched. Her face looked tired, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. They left? Jonathan asked. Margaret nodded. Late last night. Annie hugged the nurse on the way out, said thank you for letting her stay. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. He could still feel the small weight of Annie's hand in his. I thought I'd imagine it, he admitted, that I'd wake up and realize it never happened. But it did, Margaret said. Every second of it. He let out a slow breath. I don't think I would have survived the surgery if I hadn't seen her first. Margaret crossed the room and sat beside him. You don't get to decide that, she said gently. But I understand what you mean. There was a knock at the door before either of them could say more. The cardiologist entered with 2 residents trailing behind him, charts in hand. He glanced at Jonathan, then at Margaret. How are you feeling this morning? He asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. Weaker, he said honestly. But clearer, the doctor nodded. We reviewed your numbers overnight. Your condition is still unstable, but you're holding. We need to talk about the transfer. Margaret straightened slightly. Jonathan didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the doctor. When? He asked. Tomorrow, the doctor replied. We can't safely wait any longer. Jonathan nodded once. There was no resistance in him now. All right. The doctor hesitated, then added, I understand you had a visitor last night. Jonathan met his gaze. Yes. Isbecca's. The doctor studied him for a moment. Whatever that conversation gave you, he said, your vitals improved afterward. Not dramatically, but enough that the night team noticed. Jonathan gave a faint smile. Sometimes the heart responds to things you can't measure. The doctor didn't argue. Rest today, he said. We'll prepare you for transport in the morning. After they left, Margaret reached for Jonathan's hand again. Are you scared? She asked. He thought about it. The fear was there, but it no longer filled the room the way it had before. Not the way I was, he said. Yesterday, I was afraid of dying. Today, I'm afraid of wasting whatever comes next. Margaret nodded slowly. I've been thinking about Annie, she said. About her mother. Jonathan turned his head slightly toward her. What about them? I didn't know how close we lived to lives like theirs, Margaret admitted. Across town. And yet, it might as well be another country. Jonathan's fingers tightened around hers. That's on me, he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. It's on both of us. On everyone who believes distance excuses blindness. He didn't argue. Later that afternoon, Jonathan drifted in and out of sleep. Each time he woke, the image of Annie's face came back to him not as a debt, but as a reminder. He remembered her seriousness, the way she listened, the way she spoke without hesitation, as if helping him had been the most natural thing in the world. At one point, a nurse entered to check his IV. She was older, her movements unhurried. You had a visitor last night, she said with a small smile. Yes, Jonathan replied. She left a drawing, the nurse said, reaching into the pocket of her scrubs. She unfolded a piece of paper and placed it gently on the bedside table. It was a child's drawing. 2 stick figures stood side by side. One was much taller, drawn in a suit. The other was smaller, wearing what looked like a dress. Above them, a large, uneven heart filled most of the page. Jonathan stared at it for a long time. She said you might like it, the nurse added. I do, he said, his voice thick. When the nurse left, Jonathan picked up the drawing with trembling hands. On the back, in careful letters, was a message written with adult help. Feel better, love, Annie. He pressed the paper lightly to his chest, just below where the pain lived. That evening, Margaret stepped out to make a phone call. Jonathan knew what it was about without asking. Plans were being adjusted, schedules rearranged. People were being informed that Jonathan Hale would not simply return to business as usual if he returned at all. For the first time, the thought didn't bother him. When Margaret came back, her expression was serious. I spoke to the foundation, she said. They're ready to expand the hospital support program. The one you mentioned last year but never followed through on. Jonathan nodded. Good. And Jonathan, she added, this isn't about guilt. I know, he said. It's about responsibility. She studied him. You've changed. He looked at the drawing again. No, he said. I've been reminded. That night, as the lights dimmed and the hospital settled into its uneasy quiet, Jonathan lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his heart. Tomorrow, he would be moved to a place designed to save him. But tonight, he was still here, in the building where a little girl had once sat beside his bed, and refused to let go. He closed his eyes with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. Whatever happened next, he would not forget. The morning of the transfer arrived with a sense of inevitability Jonathan Hale could no longer ignore. It wasn't announced with urgency or drama. There were no raised voices, no rushing footsteps. Instead, it came quietly, carried in by a nurse who entered the room just after sunrise and began checking equipment with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said. "How are we feeling today?" Jonathan opened his eyes slowly. His chest felt tight, but steady enough. "Like someone who doesn't get to change his mind anymore," he replied. The nurse smiled politely, though her eyes held sympathy. "The transport team will be here in about an hour." Margaret stood near the window, watching the city wake up below. Traffic crawled along the streets. People walked with purpose, coffee cups in hand, unaware that for one man above them, the day carried the weight of a crossroads. "They're ready at the private facility," she said quietly. "Your surgeon called personally." Jonathan nodded. "I figured he would." There was a pause before Margaret spoke again. "Annie's mother called early this morning." Jonathan turned his head toward her. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Margaret said quickly. "She just wanted to check on you," Annie insisted. A faint smile crossed his face. "Of course she did. She asked if she could come by again," Margaret continued. "Just for a few minutes. I told her we weren't sure how tight the schedule would be." Jonathan was silent for a moment. "If she can," he said. "I'd like that." Margaret reached for his hand. "I'll see what I can do." The doctor arrived soon after, followed by a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as the transport coordinator. They explained the process in careful, measured terms. Jonathan listened without interruption, absorbing the information with a calm that surprised even himself. When they finished, the doctor lingered. "Mr. Hale," he said, "this is a complex case. The team is excellent, but I want to be honest with you." Jonathan met his gaze. "I appreciate honesty. There are risks," the doctor said. "You know that." "Yes," Jonathan replied. "And you're still willing to proceed?" Jonathan thought of Annie's drawing folded carefully beside his wallet, of the words written in uneven letters. "Feel better." "I am," he said, "but not because I'm afraid to die." "Oh, will he do?" The doctor raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm afraid to live the same way," Jonathan added. The doctor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll do everything we can." After the medical team left, the room grew quiet again. Jonathan's thoughts drifted, not to the surgery ahead, but backward to a year earlier, to the version of himself who had believed time was something he controlled. He had spent decades measuring success in numbers, market shares, growth curves, margins, but no balance sheet had ever accounted for moments like the one Annie had created simply by stopping, by choosing to care. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret turned toward the door. "Come in." Annie stepped inside, holding her mother's hand. She wore the same oversized jacket as the night before. Her eyes lit up when she saw Jonathan awake. "You're still here," she said. He smiled weakly. "So are you." Her mother looked apologetic. "We didn't want to intrude. We were told you might be leaving soon." Jonathan gestured faintly. "I am, but I'm glad you came." Annie approached the bed, careful this time, as if she understood the seriousness of the moment. "Are they fixing your heart today?" she asked. "Not today," Jonathan said. "But soon," she nodded solemnly. "My mom says doctors are like mechanics," she said. "But for people." Jonathan chuckled softly. "That's a good way to put it." Annie glanced around the room, then back at him. "Will it hurt?" "Probably," he admitted. "But it's worth it." She thought about this for a moment. "Being brave hurts sometimes," she said. "But it doesn't mean you stop." Jonathan felt something tighten in his throat. "You're right," he said. Her mother shifted slightly. "Annie," she said gently, "remember what we talked about." Annie nodded and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper and handed it to Jonathan. "I made you another one," she said. He unfolded it carefully. This one showed a hospital bed with a figure lying in it, smiling. Next to it stood a smaller figure, holding a heart. "I put the heart closer this time," Annie explained, "so it doesn't get lost." Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "Thank you," he said. "I'll take it with me." The transport team arrived moments later, the room filled with quiet activity. Equipment was adjusted. Instructions were exchanged in low voices. Annie stepped back, sensing the shift. "Do you have to go now?" she asked. "Yes," Jonathan said. "But I'll be thinking about you." She hesitated, then leaned forward and hugged him carefully, her arms light around his shoulders. "Don't forget," she said. "I won't," he promised. As they wheeled him toward the door, Jonathan looked back at Annie and her mother standing together. For a fleeting moment, he saw the world as it truly was, not divided by wealth or power, but connected by choices made in ordinary moments. The hallway stretched ahead, bright and unfamiliar. As the doors closed behind him, Jonathan Hale felt fear again. But beneath it, steady and grounding, was something new: purpose. The ride to the private hospital felt longer than Jonathan Hale had expected. The ambulance moved smoothly through traffic, its sirens silent, lights flashing without urgency. Jonathan lay strapped to the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as it passed beneath him in pieces: metal bars, dim lights, the occasional blur of motion. A paramedic sat near his feet, monitoring the equipment with quiet focus. Margaret rode in the front. Jonathan didn't mind. This part of the journey felt solitary by nature, like a passage he had to make on his own. He closed his eyes and let his breathing settle into the rhythm the paramedic had coached him into earlier. In, hold, out. Each breath felt deliberate, as if his body needed constant reminding to continue. His mind, however, wandered freely. He thought about Annie sitting on the edge of the hospital bed the year before, her legs swinging slightly because they didn't reach the floor. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with expectation, but with focus. The kind of focus people lost as they grew older, buried beneath schedules and excuses. "Mr. Hale," the paramedic said calmly. "How's your pain?" Jonathan considered it. "Manageable," he replied. "Any dizziness?" "No." The paramedic nodded, satisfied. "We'll be there soon." Soon, the word used to mean opportunity to Jonathan. Another meeting, another deal, another expansion. Now it meant something far simpler. Another chance. When the ambulance finally slowed and turned, Jonathan felt the shift before he saw anything. The movement was smoother here, controlled, purpose-built. When the doors opened, the air itself felt different, cooler, filtered, heavy with disinfectant and quiet confidence. The private hospital rose around him in clean lines and glass. Everything gleamed. Everything worked exactly as designed. The transfer team moved efficiently, their coordination seamless. Jonathan was wheeled through wide corridors, where footsteps barely echoed, and voices stayed low. Digital displays glowed softly on the walls. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved with assured precision. This was the world he knew, or thought he did. Margaret appeared at his side as they stopped briefly outside a room. "You're settled in," she said. "The surgeon will be here shortly." Jonathan nodded. "Did Annie make it home okay?" Margaret blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes," she said. "Her mother texted me. Annie asked if you were brave." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Tell her I'm trying." "I will," Margaret said, squeezing his hand before stepping back as the staff took over. They rolled him into a private room that felt more like a hotel suite than a hospital. The bed adjusted itself automatically. Screens flickered to life, displaying his vitals in calm, orderly graphs. A nurse introduced herself and explained each step with practiced reassurance. Jonathan listened politely, but his thoughts drifted again. For years, he had believed this level of care was normal, earned, expected. He had never questioned why some buildings gleamed, while others struggled to keep the lights on. He had never wondered how many Annies sat in crowded waiting rooms, unseen, unheard, hoping someone older and louder would speak up. Now, lying here, he wondered how close he had come to dying in the quieter place. The surgeon arrived just after noon. He was younger than Jonathan had expected, confident but not arrogant, his tone measured. "We'll begin preliminary procedures this afternoon," the surgeon said. "The major intervention is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Jonathan nodded. "What are my chances?" The surgeon didn't hesitate. "Very good, provided there are no complications." Jonathan studied him. "And if there are, then we respond," the surgeon said simply. "That's our job." After he left, the room settled into stillness again. Margaret returned, carrying Jonathan's personal items. She placed his wallet on the bedside table. along with Annie's drawings. "I thought you'd want these close," she said. Jonathan reached for the top, drawing the one with the heart drawn close so it wouldn't get lost. He traced the uneven lines with his finger. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about something." Margaret sat beside him. "That usually means you're planning something." "Not planning," he replied. "Reconsidering." She waited. "When I get through this," Jonathan continued, "I don't want to go back to the way things were." Margaret studied his face. "That's a big statement." "I know," he said, "but it's the only honest one I have right now." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I've spent my life reacting to crises I could see," he said. "Market downturns, competitors, risks on paper, but I ignored the quiet ones." Margaret nodded slowly. "Like underfunded hospitals. Like children who know how to save a life before they know how to spell their own name," Jonathan said. She looked at the drawings again. "You're not talking about charity," she said. "You're talking about responsibility." "Yes," he replied. "And accountability, too." The nurse returned to prepare him for the afternoon procedures. As she worked, she glanced at the drawings. "Those are nice," she said. "Are they from family?" Jonathan shook his head. "From someone who reminded me who I want to be," the nurse smiled softly. "Those reminders are rare." Later, as the room dimmed and the day stretched toward evening, Jonathan found himself alone again. The machines hummed steadily. The pain ebbed and flowed, kept in check by medication. He stared at the ceiling, but his thoughts were clear. If he survived, there would be statements to make, boards to face, decisions to justify. Some would call him impulsive. Others would say he was overcorrecting. He didn't care. For the first time in decades, his choices were not driven by fear of loss or hunger for more. They were driven by something quieter and far more demanding: memory. He closed his eyes, holding the image of Annie standing beside his hospital bed, holding a heart close so it wouldn't drift away. Tomorrow, his heart would be opened by strangers with steady hands and sharp tools. Tonight, it was already open in a different way. Night settled over the private hospital with a controlled stillness that felt almost artificial. The lights dimmed automatically at 9. The hallway outside Jonathan Hale's room fell quiet, interrupted only by the soft footsteps of nurses moving from one room to the next. Everything here was designed to suggest calm, precision, reassurance. And yet, as Jonathan lay awake, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the glass wall opposite his bed, he felt more exposed than he had in years. Tomorrow morning, they would open his chest. The thought arrived without drama, without panic, and lingered like a simple fact. He had signed the consent forms. He had listened to the explanations. He knew the odds. Still, something about the finality of the night pressed heavily on him. Margaret had gone home an hour earlier, reluctantly, after the nurse insisted he needed uninterrupted rest. She had leaned down and kissed his forehead, something she hadn't done in public in a long time. "I'll be here before sunrise," she promised. "I know," Jonathan said. Now, alone. He shifted slightly, feeling the dull ache in his chest respond. He closed his eyes, then opened them again. Sleep refused to come. Instead, memories surfaced uninvited, unfiltered. He saw himself at 22, fresh out of college, standing in a cramped apartment with a borrowed desk and a second-hand laptop, convinced that success was something you chased until you caught it or collapsed trying. He remembered the first deal that worked, the first time someone had called him sir with real respect, the first time he'd chosen profit over people and told himself it was temporary. Temporary had lasted a lifetime. A quiet knock broke the silence. Jonathan turned his head. "Come in," he said. The nurse entered, carrying a clipboard. She was younger than the one from the public hospital, her movements crisp, professional. "Just a quick check before shift change," she said. She adjusted his IV, checked his vitals, then paused when her eyes fell on the drawings beside his wallet. "Those are sweet," she said. "Your daughter?" Jonathan shook his head. "No." She raised an eyebrow, curious but polite. "A niece?" "No," he said again, then added, "A friend." The nurse smiled faintly. "Friends come in all forms." She finished her checks and hesitated. "You're scheduled first thing in the morning," she said. "If there's anything you need tonight." Jonathan considered the offer. "Can you do me a favor?" "Of course. Make sure those go with me tomorrow," he said, nodding toward the drawings. No matter where they move me. The nurse followed his gaze and nodded. I'll make a note. After she left, Jonathan picked up the top drawing again. The heart Annie had drawn was imperfect, uneven, but unmistakably intentional. She had placed it close to the figures, as if proximity itself was protection. He wondered what she was doing right now. Probably asleep. Probably dreaming about school or cartoons or something far removed from operating rooms and mortality. He hoped, fiercely, that tonight was just another ordinary night for her. His phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. Margaret, you awake? Yes, he typed back. There was a pause. Then another message appeared. I couldn't sleep either. Jonathan smiled faintly. He typed slowly, his fingers unsteady. I'm thinking about everything I didn't see before. Her reply came quickly. And I don't want to forget it when this is over. Another pause. Then, you won't. People don't come back from moments like this unchanged. Jonathan stared at the words for a long time before setting the phone down. Moments like this. He thought of the sidewalk a year ago. Of the pain that had dropped him to the ground without warning. Of the way the world had narrowed to sound and breath and fear. And then, through that fear, a small voice refusing to be ignored. He had spent his life surrounded by powerful voices. Advisors, executives, lawyers. None of them had saved him. Annie had. The realization no longer came with guilt. It came with clarity. Shortly after midnight, a soft sound drifted from the hallway, someone crying quietly, trying not to be heard. Jonathan listened, then slowly pushed himself up just enough to see through the glass. A man stood a few rooms down, leaning against the wall. His head bowed. He looked older than Jonathan. His shoulders slumped under a weight Jonathan recognized too well. A nurse approached the man and spoke to him softly. He nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. Jonathan lay back again. This place saved lives every day, he knew. But it also held fear, and waiting, and unanswered prayers. It just hid them better. At some point, sleep finally found him. He dreamed of standing on the same sidewalk from a year ago. The city moved around him, unaware. This time, when the pain came, he didn't fall. Instead, he saw Annie standing a few steps away, holding the drawing of the heart. Don't drop it, she said. He woke with a start, his heart racing. The clock read 4:17 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. Jonathan lay there, breathing slowly, letting his pulse settle. He reached for the drawings again, pressing them lightly against his chest. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would carry this with him, not as a debt, as a direction. Jonathan Hale woke before the alarm. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was too clean, too white, broken only by recessed lights and a thin line where two panels met. Then the weight in his chest reminded him, the private hospital, the surgery. Today, he turned his head slowly. The digital clock on the wall read 5:42 a.m. Soon, a nurse entered quietly, her voice low and practiced. Good morning, Mr. Hale. How are you feeling? Jonathan considered the question. Awake, he said. More than I expected. She smiled faintly. That happens. Big days tend to do that. She checked his vitals, efficient but gentle. The numbers flickered across the screen, steady enough to proceed, fragile enough to command respect. You'll be heading down in about 40 minutes, she said. Your wife is already on her way. Jonathan nodded. Thank you. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Can I ask you something? She paused. Of course. Thanks for watching. Do people usually talk before this? He asked. I mean, about things that don't show up on charts. The nurse studied him for a moment. More than you'd think, she said. Some talk about faith. Some about regrets. Some about promises they plan to keep. And does it help? Jonathan asked. She smiled softly. It doesn't change the procedure, but it changes the person walking into it. After she left, Jonathan lay back, staring at the ceiling again. The room felt smaller now, as if it were gently closing in around him. He reached for his wallet and the drawings beside it, lining them up carefully on the blanket, the way someone might arrange important documents before a meeting. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, her coat still buttoned, her hair pulled back hastily. She looked tired, but determined. You beat the alarm, she said. So did you. Jonathan replied. She sat beside him and took his hand. I barely slept. Me neither. 35 now. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the machines. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice measured. I spoke to Annie's mother last night, she said. After you fell asleep. Jonathan turned his head toward her. Is she all right? She is, Margaret said. She was surprised, overwhelmed. She didn't expect the attention. She kept saying they didn't do anything special. Jonathan let out a quiet breath. That's usually how the most important things happen. Be present, Margaret nodded. She was worried she might have caused trouble by coming. Jonathan frowned slightly. Trouble? She lives carefully, Margaret explained. She didn't want Annie to be misunderstood or used. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. I understand that. Margaret studied him. You really do now, don't you? Yes, he said simply. There was a knock at the door. The surgeon entered, calm and composed, followed by an anesthesiologist. They reviewed the plan again, explaining each step, each possibility. Jonathan listened closely, asking a few questions, nodding when appropriate. At the end, the surgeon paused. Do you have any questions before we proceed? Jonathan glanced at the drawings on his bed, then back at the surgeon. Just one, he said. How long until I'll know if it worked? The surgeon considered this. The first few hours will tell us a lot, he said. The first few days will tell us more. Jonathan nodded. All right. When they left, Margaret leaned closer. You didn't tell them you're planning to change the world, she said quietly. Jonathan smiled faintly. Let's start with surviving. The transport team arrived soon after. Jonathan was transferred carefully onto the gurney, the room suddenly stripped of its familiarity. As they prepared to move him, he reached out. Margaret, he said. She leaned down. Yes? If anything happens. Don't, she interrupted gently. He met her eyes. If anything happens, he continued. Promise me something. She hesitated, then nodded. What? Stay connected to Annie, he said. Not as a symbol, as a person. Margaret swallowed. I promise. The gurney began to move. The ceiling slid past above him again, this time brighter, closer. Jonathan focused on his breathing, steadying himself as they turned down a long corridor toward the operating wing. As they passed a waiting area, he caught sight of other families sitting quietly, some holding hands, some staring into space. Different lives, same fear. The doors to the surgical wing opened automatically. Just before they wheeled him inside, Jonathan spoke again, his voice low but clear. Wait. The team paused. Jonathan reached down and pressed the drawings against his chest. These come with me, he said. The nurse nodded. They will, Ed. As the doors closed and the lights shifted to a harsher white, Jonathan felt the edge of fear rise again. But beneath it was something steadier, something earned. He wasn't walking into this alone. He closed his eyes as the anesthesiologist began to speak, his voice calm, guiding. The last thing Jonathan thought of before the world faded was a small voice saying, "Don't let it get lost." Time disappeared the moment the anesthesia took hold. Jonathan Hale drifted downward, not into darkness, but into a strange, weightless quiet, where thoughts came without order and memories surfaced without warning. He did not dream in images at first. There was only sensation, pressure, release, a distant echo of voices he could not understand. Then the memories returned. He was walking again, 1 year ago. The city loud around him. Cars honking. Someone laughing on a phone. His own footsteps steady on the pavement. He remembered thinking about a meeting he was late for. An email he hadn't answered. A deal that needed tightening. Important things. Urgent things. Then the pain. In the dream, he felt it bloom in his chest like fire. His legs buckled. The sidewalk rushed up to meet him. But this time, instead of panic, there was stillness. He saw himself from above, a man in an expensive coat lying helpless among strangers who slowed, glanced, then hesitated, and then, cutting through it all, a small figure appeared. Annie. She was smaller in the dream. 5 years old again, her shoes scuffed, her jacket too thin for the weather. She didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh consequences. She ran toward him as if the world had asked her a question and she already knew the answer. Hey! she shouted in the dream, her voice sharp and insistent. Help him! Jonathan watched people turn. Some stopped, some didn't, but enough did. The dream shifted. Now Annie stood beside his hospital bed, the one from the public hospital, not this private one. The machines were louder there. The walls were duller, but the room felt warmer. She held his hand, just like before. Don't go to sleep, she said. I'm tired, he answered. I know, she said. But don't go yet. The scene blurred, then rearranged itself again. Jonathan felt pressure in his chest, deeper now, heavier. He sensed hands working with precision he couldn't see. Voices spoke in calm, clipped phrases. Numbers were called out. Adjustments made. The rhythm of his heart faltered, then steadied. Somewhere far away, a machine beeped in a different pattern. In the dream, Annie frowned. Your heart's being stubborn, she said. So am I, Jonathan replied. She nodded approvingly. Good. Hours passed in minutes. Or minutes passed in hours. Time had no shape here. Then, gradually, the quiet began to fracture. Sound returned first, a muffled voice, a steady, deliberate tone. Jonathan tried to move, but his body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Jonathan, a voice said, can you hear me? He wanted to answer. His lips wouldn't cooperate. Jonathan, the voice repeated, closer now. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. There was a pause. Then, with effort that felt monumental, his fingers twitched. That's good, the voice said. You're doing great. Light pressed against his closed eyelids. Not harsh, but insistent. Jonathan winced slightly, then forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar. Lower than before. The lights were dimmer. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. A nurse leaned over him, her face calm. Welcome back, she said. Jonathan tried to speak. His throat felt raw, his mouth dry. Only a faint sound came out. Easy, the nurse said. You've been through a long procedure. He swallowed, then tried again. Did it work? She smiled. The surgery went very well. Relief washed through him so suddenly it almost made him dizzy. How long? He managed. Almost 6 hours, she replied. You're in recovery now. The next few hours are important. But your heart responded exactly the way we hoped. Jonathan closed his eyes again, letting the words sink in. A moment later, another voice entered the space. Familiar. Tight with emotion. Jonathan? He opened his eyes and turned his head slightly. Margaret stood beside the bed, her eyes red, her hand already reaching for his. You're here, he whispered. Of course I am, she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. You scared me. I'm sorry, he murmured. She shook her head. Don't. He squeezed her hand weakly. Annie, he said, the word barely audible. Did you tell her? Margaret smiled through tears. She knows you went into surgery. She asked me to tell you she was thinking about you. We get. Jonathan's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't pain. Good, he whispered. The nurse adjusted something at his side. He needs to rest now, she said gently. Margaret nodded, brushing her thumb lightly across Jonathan's knuckles. I'll be right outside. As she stepped away, Jonathan's gaze drifted to the small table beside his bed. The drawings were there, placed carefully, just as he had asked. He stared at them, his vision still blurred, but the shapes were unmistakable. 2 figures. A heart drawn close, refusing to be lost. For the first time since he had woken, Jonathan smiled. The world hadn't ended while he was gone, and he hadn't let go. Jonathan Hale woke slowly, as if rising through deep water. The first thing he noticed was the weight. Not pain exactly, but pressure tight, persistent, centered in his chest. It reminded him that something fundamental had been opened, adjusted, and stitched back together. The second thing he noticed was the silence. Not the clinical quiet of an operating room, but the softer hush of recovery, where machines spoke in low tones and human voices knew when to stay away. He turned his head slightly. The clock on the wall read 3:18 p.m. So much time had passed. A nurse noticed the movement and stepped closer. She checked his vitals, nodded to herself, then leaned in. You're doing well, she said. Better than expected. Jonathan tried to answer, but his voice came out thin. Feels strange. It will, she replied. Your body is learning a new rhythm. A new rhythm. The words lingered with him as she adjusted his blankets and moved away. He lay still, letting his breathing find its pace. In. Out. Each breath felt deliberate. Earned. Margaret returned an hour later. She moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. When Jonathan opened his eyes again, she was already seated beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed. "You're awake," she said. "Still here," he replied. She smiled, relief flickering across her face. "The surgeon just checked in. He's pleased. Cautiously optimistic, but pleased." Jonathan nodded. "That's about as good as they get." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." She hesitated, then added, "I heard from Annie's mother again." Jonathan's eyes sharpened with interest. "Is she all right?" "She is," Margaret said. "Annie wanted to know if your heart was behaving." Jonathan let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Tell her it's learning." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "She also sent this." She turned the screen toward him. It was a photo. Annie sat at a small kitchen table, crayons scattered everywhere. She held up a new drawing to the camera, her smile wide and proud. The heart was there again, bigger this time, brighter, drawn in red. Jonathan stared at it, his vision blurring. "She keeps drawing the heart," he said softly. Margaret nodded. "I think that's how she understands what happened." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. "It's how I understand it too." The afternoon stretched on quietly. Doctors came and went, offering updates in careful language. Jonathan listened, asked a few questions, then let the rest wash over him. What mattered was simple. The surgery had worked. The danger wasn't gone, but it had been pushed back. As evening approached, the room took on a different tone. The lights softened. The hallway sounds thinned. Jonathan felt exhaustion settle into his bones, heavier than anything he had known before. He slept briefly, waking again to the sound of Margaret's voice speaking softly to someone near the door. "Yes," she said. "He's awake, but very tired." A pause. "All right," she continued. "Just for a minute." Jonathan turned his head, confused. The door opened slowly. Annie stepped inside. She moved more cautiously this time, as if the room itself required respect. Her mother followed, staying close to the doorway. Annie's eyes went straight to Jonathan's face. "You look different," she said. Jonathan smiled weakly. "I feel different." She walked closer, peering at the tubes and wires with curiosity rather than fear. "Did they fix it?" "They did," Jonathan said. "Thanks to you." Annie frowned. "I didn't do anything this time." "Yes, you did," he replied. "You reminded me why it mattered." She seemed to think about that, then nodded, satisfied. Her mother stepped forward slightly. "We didn't want to stay long," she said. "The nurse said it was okay, but only briefly." Jonathan looked at her. "I'm grateful you came." She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Annie has been asking questions." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About why people on TV were talking about her," her mother said. "And why you needed to find her." Jonathan swallowed. "What did you tell her?" "That sometimes grown-ups forget to say thank you," she replied. "And sometimes they need help remembering." Jonathan nodded slowly. "That sounds right." Annie climbed onto the chair beside the bed, sitting very still. "Are you going to go back to work now?" she asked. "Not right away," Jonathan said. "I have some thinking to do." "About what?" "About how to do things better," he replied. Annie smiled. "That's good." Her mother glanced at the clock. "Annie, we should let him rest." Annie stood, then leaned forward carefully, placing her small hand on Jonathan's forearm. "Don't forget," she said again. "I won't," he promised. After they left, the room felt fuller than before, as if something important had been affirmed rather than concluded. Margaret sat back down beside him. "You know," she said quietly, "people are starting to call. The board, the foundation. They want to know when you'll be ready to talk." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "They'll have to wait." Margaret studied him. "You're serious?" "Yes," he said. "For the first time, I want my recovery to be about more than returning." "Well," she nodded. "About redirecting?" Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling the steady beat beneath his ribs. "Exactly." That night, As the hospital settled once more into its careful quiet, Jonathan lay awake thinking about the road ahead. It would not be simple. Some decisions would be resisted, some truths would be uncomfortable, but his heart, newly repaired, newly aware, kept its rhythm. And in that rhythm, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: alignment. Recovery did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, measured breaths, cautious movements, short walks that felt longer than they should have. Jonathan Hale learned quickly that surviving surgery was not the same as reclaiming strength. His body demanded patience, something he had rarely given anything before. The morning after Annie's second visit, a physical therapist arrived with a clipboard and a calm smile. She explained the plan in simple terms, reminding him often to listen to what his body told him rather than what his mind demanded. "Slow is not failure," she said, as she helped him sit up. "It's strategy." Jonathan nodded, though the lesson felt unfamiliar. Each step along the corridor left him slightly breathless. The private hospital remained efficient, spotless, reassuring, but it no longer impressed him the way it once might have. He noticed different things now. The quiet exhaustion in a nurse's eyes after a long shift. The way an older patient clutched the handrail as if it were the last stable thing in the world. When he returned to his room, Margaret was waiting with news. "The board called again," she said. "Twice." Jonathan eased himself back into bed. "Let them." She watched him carefully. "They're worried." "Good," he replied. "That means they're paying attention." Margaret sat down. "You can't stay silent forever." "I don't plan to," Jonathan said. "I plan to speak when I'm clear." She nodded slowly. "You already are." "Clearer," he corrected. That afternoon, Jonathan asked for a laptop. When it arrived, he didn't open financial reports or market updates. Instead, he searched for the public hospital where his story with Annie had begun. He studied its funding gaps, its patient volumes, the neighborhoods it served. He saw patterns he had ignored for years. Later, a familiar nurse entered, the same one who had helped arrange Annie's visit. She checked his vitals, then hesitated as if deciding whether to speak. "You're doing well," she said. "The team's impressed." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I had good motivation." She glanced at the drawings beside his bed. "I heard about the little girl," she said. "People talk," Jonathan nodded. "I hope they're talking about the right things." The nurse met his gaze. "Some are," she said. "Others are just curious." Curiosity. Jonathan understood it well. "What about you?" he asked. She smiled. "I think sometimes people with the loudest voices forget how much they owe to the quiet ones." Jonathan absorbed that in silence. That evening, Margaret read him messages sent through the foundation letters from strangers who had seen the news segment. Parents thanking Annie, nurses sharing stories of children who had stepped up when adults hesitated. One message stood out, from Annie's mother. She thanked Jonathan for the kindness shown to her daughter, but she also asked, carefully, whether the attention would fade. Jonathan closed his eyes when Margaret finished reading. "That's the real question, isn't it?" he said. Margaret nodded. "She's worried about being forgotten once the cameras move on." Jonathan reached for his phone. His hands still trembled slightly, but his resolve did not. "Help me write something," he said. "To her?" Margaret asked. "To everyone," Jonathan replied. "But start with her." They worked slowly. Jonathan dictated, stopping often to catch his breath. He spoke about gratitude without spectacle, about responsibility without charity language, about remembering names and faces long after headlines passed. When they finished, Margaret read it back to him. Jonathan listened carefully, then nodded. "Send it." The following morning, the surgeon stopped by again. "You're healing on schedule," he said. "If things continue this way, we'll be talking discharge plans soon." Jonathan smiled. "I never thought I'd look forward to being sent home." The surgeon hesitated. "One more thing," he said. "There's been interest." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "In my heart? In your story," the surgeon clarified. "People want to know what comes next." Jonathan considered that. "Then they'll have to wait and see." That afternoon, Annie sent another drawing. This one showed 3 figures, now one tall, one small, and one in between. Above them, the heart hovered, larger than before. No longer in danger of drifting away, Jonathan stared at it for a long time. "Who's the third person?" he asked Margaret. Margaret smiled. "Maybe it's who you're becoming." Jonathan leaned back, feeling the steady beat beneath his ribs. For the first time since the surgery, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by urgency or accumulation, just intention. The first time Jonathan Hale stood by the window without feeling dizzy, he knew something had shifted. It was a small victory by any medical standard. He had only been upright for a few minutes, the city stretching out below him in clean lines of glass and steel. But his legs held. His breath stayed steady, his heart repaired, reinforced, humbled, kept its rhythm without complaint. Margaret noticed before he did. "You're not swaying," she said quietly. Jonathan smiled. "Don't jinx it." She joined him at the window, careful not to crowd him. Outside, the city moved with its usual confidence. Cars merged, people crossed streets. Somewhere below, decisions were being made that would never make the news. "I used to love this view," Jonathan said. "It made everything feel manageable." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now it feels honest," he replied. "Big, complicated, full of people I don't know." Margaret studied him. "You're seeing it differently." "Yes," he said, "and I don't want that to fade." The door opened softly. A case manager stepped in, carrying a folder thick with forms. She smiled professionally, but her tone was warm. "Mr. Hale, we should talk about discharge planning." Jonathan nodded. "I was wondering when that would come up." "If everything continues on track," she said, "you could be released within the week. There will be follow-ups, restrictions, therapy. This isn't a return to normal yet." Jonathan met her gaze. "I'm not aiming for normal." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not surprised. "That's good," she said. "Normal is overrated." After she left, Margaret sat down with the folder. "Home care, medication schedules, cardiac rehab," she read aloud. "You'll hate the restrictions." Jonathan shrugged. "I've hated worse." She closed the folder. "There's something else." He looked at her. "The foundation board is requesting a statement," she said. "Not about your health, about the hospital." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I was afraid of that." "Afraid?" Margaret echoed. "Of saying too much too soon," he clarified. "Or too little. Too late." Margaret leaned back. "You don't owe them perfection. You owe them honesty." Jonathan considered that. Honesty had never been the currency of his world. Transparency was discussed, but only when it benefited the bottom line. Now, honesty felt heavier, riskier, necessary. "Set up a call," he said finally, "but not yet." When? When I've spoken to Annie's mother again." Margaret nodded. "She called this morning." Jonathan turned toward her. "Is something wrong?" "No," Margaret said quickly. "She was checking in. She wanted to know how you were doing. And she had a question." Jonathan waited. "She asked if you expected anything from Annie," Margaret said carefully. "Long term." Jonathan felt a tightening in his chest, not pain, but recognition. "Tell her no," he said. "Tell her I expect nothing. Not gratitude, not appearances, not stories." Margaret studied him. "And what do you want?" "I want her to grow up without thinking she owes the world for doing the right thing," Jonathan said. "I want her to know she didn't save a billionaire. She saved a man." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'll tell her." That afternoon, Jonathan sat alone with the laptop open on his tray. He stared at the screen for a long time without typing. Words had always come easily to him in contracts, proposals, speeches. These felt different. He began slowly, not with announcements or commitments, but with a memory. He wrote about the sidewalk, about the pain, about a small voice that refused to let adults look away. He wrote about waking up to a hand holding his, steady and unafraid. He wrote about the distance between hospitals that looked small on a map and enormous in practice. He stopped often, resting his eyes, checking his breathing. When Margaret returned, she found him still working. "You don't have to finish today," she said. "I know," Jonathan replied. "But I need to start." That evening, a nurse brought dinner simple, carefully portioned. Jonathan ate slowly, aware of each bite. Food tasted different now, not dulled by distraction or urgency. As he ate, his phone buzzed. A message from Annie's mother. Margaret read it first, then handed him the phone. "Annie keeps asking when she can draw you with a bandage on your chest. She says that means you're healing." Jonathan smiled, a warmth spreading through him that no medication could replicate. "Tell her she can draw whatever she wants," he typed back. And tell her I'm proud of her. The reply came quickly. She smiled when I told her. Jonathan set the phone down and leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Pride was a strange word for him. He had chased it for decades in ways that never quite satisfied. This was different. This was quiet. Grounded. Later that night, as the hospital lights dimmed, Margaret spoke again. You know this will change things, she said. Some people won't like it. Jonathan nodded. Some people never do. And you're okay with that? He thought of Annie standing beside his bed, asking if his heart was behaving. Of her certainty. Of her lack of fear. Yes, he said. For the first time, I am. Uncreated. Margaret reached for his hand. Then whatever comes next, she said. We face it honestly. Jonathan squeezed her fingers gently. Together, as sleep began to pull at him, Jonathan's thoughts returned not to surgery or recovery schedules, but to the idea of continuity. Of showing up again and again, without fanfare. Of keeping promises long after the spotlight dimmed. His heart beat steadily beneath his ribs, not just repaired, directed. The day Jonathan Hale was cleared to leave his room for longer walks, the hospital corridors revealed themselves in a way he hadn't noticed before. They were not just passageways, they were holding spaces. He moved slowly, one measured step at a time, Margaret beside him, the physical therapist a few feet ahead. Each turn of the hallway exposed a different pocket of quiet human struggle. A man staring at the floor as if answers might appear there. A woman whispering into her phone with forced calm. An elderly couple holding hands without speaking at all. Jonathan felt the weight of it, not as guilt, as awareness. You don't have to look at everyone like that, the therapist said lightly, noticing his gaze linger. You'll wear yourself out. I should have been looking all along, Jonathan replied. She gave him a thoughtful glance, but didn't argue. When they returned to his room, Margaret helped him settle into the chair by the window. He was breathing harder now, his energy thinning, but his eyes were alert. You pushed yourself, she said. I needed to see it, he answered. See what? This place, he said. Not the equipment, the people. Margaret nodded slowly. It changes things when you stop being the exception. Oh, Jonathan rested his head back briefly, letting the fatigue wash through him. The surgeon's words echoed in his mind. Progress measured in inches, not leaps. That afternoon, the call with the foundation board finally happened. Margaret set up the video conference, then took a seat slightly out of frame. Jonathan adjusted himself in the chair, the laptop balanced carefully in front of him. One by one, familiar faces filled the screen, men and women he had worked alongside for years. Some smiled warmly, others looked cautious. Jonathan, one of them began. We're relieved to see you recovering. Thank you, Jonathan replied. I am too. There was a pause. Then another voice spoke. There's been attention around your hospitalization. Jonathan nodded. I'm aware. Some are concerned about how this reflects on the foundation. The voice continued. We need clarity. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, ignoring the pull in his chest. You'll have it, he said, but not in the form you're expecting. The room fell quiet. For years, Jonathan continued, we've funded projects based on visibility and scale. We've measured impact the way corporations do, numbers first, people second. Several faces shifted uncomfortably. That approach saved lives, Jonathan acknowledged, and it also missed many. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not proposing a rebrand. I'm proposing a refocus. On what? Someone asked. On access, Jonathan replied. On listening. On supporting institutions that don't make headlines but keep communities alive. Margaret watched from the side, her expression unreadable. I won't push this through alone, Jonathan said, but I will insist we start. The silence that followed was longer this time. Finally, a woman near the bottom of the screen spoke. What changed? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Someone reminded me that survival shouldn't depend on proximity to privilege. The call ended without resolution, but without resistance either. It was, Jonathan knew, the beginning of a longer conversation. When the screen went dark, he leaned back, exhausted. Margaret moved closer. That took courage, she said. Jonathan shook his head slightly. It took honesty. She smiled faintly. Sometimes that's harder. That evening, Annie visited again. She burst into the room with less caution this time, her confidence growing with each visit. You're sitting up, she announced. Jonathan laughed softly. I am. It's a big deal. She inspected him carefully. You look tired. I am, he admitted. That's okay, Annie said. You're supposed to be. Her mother hovered near the door, watching the exchange with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Annie drew something new, she said, holding out a folded paper. Jonathan took it carefully. The drawing showed a building with many windows. Inside each window was a small figure. Outside stood a larger figure, hands open. What is it? Jonathan asked. The hospital, Annie said. And you, he swallowed. And what am I doing? Making sure nobody gets left out, she replied, as if the answer were obvious. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. That's a good picture. Her mother stepped forward. We wanted to talk to you, she said quietly. About what comes next. Jonathan met her gaze. I want you to know something first, he said. Nothing I do from here on out is because I expect anything in return. Not from you, not from Annie. She nodded, though her shoulders remained tense. I don't want Annie growing up thinking she owes the world for being kind, Jonathan continued. I want the world to meet her halfway. Her eyes softened. That would mean a lot. After they left, Jonathan sat quietly, the drawing resting in his lap. Do you realize, Margaret said softly, that she sees you differently now? Jonathan nodded. I hope not too differently. She sees you as someone who listens, Margaret replied. That might be worse. He smiled. I can live with that. Later that night, as the city lights flickered on below, Jonathan wrote again. This time, he didn't write about himself. He wrote about systems, about small decisions made every day that determined who waited and who didn't. He stopped often, his hand cramping, his energy fading. But he didn't stop completely, because now, stopping meant something else. It meant turning away, and he was no longer willing to do that. Discharge day arrived without celebration. There were no speeches, no sense of triumph, only a quiet efficiency that moved Jonathan Hale from patient to person in transition. Papers were signed, instructions repeated, medications carefully explained. The hospital that had held his life together piece by piece now prepared to let him go. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in simple clothes that felt unfamiliar after days in a gown. His chest still ached. A dull reminder that healing was ongoing, not complete. Margaret stood nearby, reviewing a checklist with the nurse. You'll need help at home, the nurse said, at least for the first few weeks. I know, Jonathan replied, and I'll take it. The nurse smiled slightly. That's usually the hardest part. Jonathan didn't argue. He had learned enough to know when resistance served no one. When the nurse left, Margaret turned to him. Are you ready? Jonathan looked around the room one last time. The chair by the window, the small table where Annie's drawings had accumulated, the quiet space where fear had softened into resolve. Yes, he said. I think I am. They moved slowly through the corridors, Jonathan leaning lightly on Margaret's arm. Staff members nodded as they passed, some with professional warmth, others with something more personal. He recognized it now, recognition without entitlement. At the exit, sunlight spilled through the glass doors, brighter than he remembered. The air outside felt sharper, colder, filled with sound, traffic, voices, life continuing without pause. Jonathan stopped just short of the door. Margaret noticed. What is it? I didn't walk out last time, he said quietly. A year ago. She squeezed his arm. You are now. They stepped outside together. A car waited at the curb, discreet, unmarked. As Jonathan eased into the back seat, he felt a wave of fatigue settle over him, not the kind that frightened him, but the kind that asked for rest. The drive home passed in fragments. Buildings slid by. Neighborhoods shifted. Jonathan watched them with new attention, noting the transitions he had once ignored. When they arrived, the house felt strangely quiet. Familiar, but altered by absence. Jonathan moved carefully through the entryway, taking in details he hadn't noticed before: the scuff near the doorframe, the faint smell of polish and something older, lived in. He sat down heavily in the living room, closing his eyes. Margaret brought him water, then sat across from him. You don't have to do anything today, she said. Or tomorrow. Jonathan nodded. I know. There was a pause before he spoke again. Annie's mother called. Margaret looked up. Today? Yes, Jonathan said. She wanted to know if we made it home safely. Margaret smiled. Did you tell her? I did, he said. She said Annie asked when she could visit. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And I told her we'd wait until the doctor says it's okay, Jonathan replied. But that she'd be welcome. Margaret leaned back. You're serious about keeping them in your life. Yes, Jonathan said, but carefully, on their terms, not ours. End quote. That night, Jonathan slept in his own bed for the first time since the surgery. Sleep came in waves, shallow at first, then deeper. He dreamed less this time. No operating rooms, no pain, only movement, walking, pausing, listening. Morning brought stiffness and soreness, but also clarity. Jonathan took his medication, ate a small breakfast, and settled into the chair by the window. From there, he watched the street below, neighbors heading to work, a child waiting for a bus, an older man walking a dog with measured steps. Margaret joined him with a tablet. Messages are piling up, she said. Some supportive, some less so. Jonathan didn't look away from the window. Read me one. She hesitated, then selected one at random. A board member says your comments are emotionally driven and could destabilize established partnerships. Jonathan nodded. That's honest. 1. Is that all you're going to say? For now, he replied. Emotion is what made me notice the problem. Reason will help me fix it. Later that day, Jonathan received a delivery, a simple envelope, handwritten address. Inside was a card from Annie. The front showed a heart, colored carefully inside the lines. On the inside, in uneven letters, were the words, "Welcome home." Jonathan closed his eyes, the weight of it settling over him. That afternoon, he made his first call, not to the board, not to investors, not to advisors. He called the public hospital. The administrator sounded surprised, cautious, unsure what this call meant. Jonathan introduced himself without titles. I'd like to visit, he said, quietly. No press, no announcements. There was a pause. May I ask why? Yes, Jonathan replied. Because I owe them my life. And because I want to understand what they need. The line went silent for a moment. Let me check, the administrator said finally. When the call ended, Jonathan leaned back, exhausted but steady. Margaret watched him. You're really doing this? Yes, he said, one step at a time. As evening fell, Jonathan felt the familiar ache in his chest again. Not dangerous, just insistent. A reminder of limits. He rested, and in that rest, he understood something that had eluded him for decades. Change didn't begin with declarations. It began with showing up. The public hospital looked smaller than Jonathan Hale remembered. From the outside, it blended into the neighborhood with an unassuming stubbornness, brick worn by decades of weather. Windows that reflected more sky than ambition. No banners, no glass atriums, just a building that had learned how to endure. Jonathan sat in the back seat of the car, watching it come into view. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with something closer to reverence. You don't have to go in if you're not ready, Margaret said gently. I am, Jonathan replied. That's why I asked to come. They had insisted on keeping the visit quiet. No cameras, no press, no announcements. Just Jonathan, Margaret, and the administrator who had agreed after some hesitation to meet them personally. Inside, the air was different from the private hospital. Thicker, lived in. The scent of disinfectant mixed with something warmer, coffee, old paper, human proximity. The floors showed signs of age, but they were clean, efficient. A woman in her late 50s greeted them in the lobby. Her posture was professional, but her eyes carried the fatigue of someone who had learned to manage scarcity without complaint. Mr. Hale, she said, I'm Linda Perez, hospital administrator. Jonathan extended his hand carefully. Thank you for seeing me. She nodded. I wasn't sure why you wanted to come without notice, but I understand now. They walked slowly through the corridors. Jonathan leaned lightly on a cane, not because he couldn't walk without it, but because his body reminded him not to rush. As they passed rooms, he saw what he hadn't seen before. Nurses doing more with less. Doctors pausing to explain things twice, sometimes 3 times. Families waiting with quiet patience, hope tempered by experience. This is where you were brought in, Linda said, stopping outside a familiar room. Jonathan stared at the door. I remember the ceiling, he said quietly, not the walls. Linda smiled faintly. Most people don't. He stepped inside. The room was empty now, cleaned, reset, ready for the next emergency. But Jonathan could still see at the bed, the machines, the chair where a 5-year-old girl had once sat, refusing to let go of a stranger's hand. I woke up here, he said, and she was holding me like she'd known me all her life. Linda watched him carefully. Annie, Jonathan nodded. You know her name. We know a lot of names like hers, Linda said. They just don't make records. Jonathan turned to her. That's a problem. Yes, Linda agreed. It is. They continued walking. Jonathan asked questions, not as an executive, but as a man who wanted to understand. How many patients they saw each day, where the bottlenecks were, what they needed but couldn't ask for. Linda answered honestly. She didn't dramatize. She didn't soften. We don't need saviors, she said at one point. We need partners who stay after the ribbon cutting. Jonathan stopped walking and looked at her. That's exactly why I'm here. They sat in a small conference room near the back of the building. The chairs didn't match. The table bore the marks of years of use. Jonathan placed Annie's drawing on the table without comment. Linda noticed it. Is that? Yes, Jonathan said. She drew it for me after the surgery. Oh. Linda studied the drawing for a long moment. She used to draw while waiting here, she said softly. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Annie waited with her aunt sometimes. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The image settled into him with quiet force. I don't want to fix this hospital, he said finally. Not alone, and not overnight. Linda folded her hands. Then what do you want? I want to listen, Jonathan said. And I want to commit to what I hear, not publicly, not performatively, just consistently. Linda leaned back, evaluating him. We've heard that before. I know, Jonathan said. That's why I didn't bring a check today. Her eyebrow lifted slightly. That's a first. I brought time, he said. And a willingness to be told no. The conversation stretched on. They talked about staffing shortages, outdated equipment, the quiet burnout that never made headlines. Jonathan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was carefully, without promises he couldn't keep. When they finally stood to leave, Linda walked them back to the lobby. You know, she said, some people come here to feel better about themselves. Jonathan met her gaze. I came here to feel worse. That's how I know it matters. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Jonathan paused at the curb, breathing carefully. Margaret waited, giving him space. That was heavy, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. And necessary. They were quiet on the drive home. Jonathan watched the city again, but now he saw it layered resources and absences overlapping. Choices invisible but decisive. At home, he rested. The visit had taken more from him than he expected. His body reminded him that resolve did not override recovery. That evening, Margaret brought him tea and sat beside him. You didn't promise anything, she said. No, Jonathan replied. But I committed. It's… to what? To not looking away again. His phone buzzed softly. A message from Annie's mother. Annie says she hopes your heart likes its new job. Jonathan smiled, warmth spreading through him. Tell her it does, he typed back, and that it's learning every day. As night settled in, Jonathan leaned back, feeling the steady beat in his chest. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't effortless, but it was honest, and for the first time, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed Jonathan Hale's visit to the public hospital unfolded without headlines. That was intentional. Recovery settled into a rhythm that was both humbling and instructive. Mornings began with medication, slow stretches, and short walks that reminded Jonathan how far he still had to go. Afternoons were reserved for rest and reading. Evenings brought conversations, some easy, some uncomfortable, that forced him to confront the world he had helped shape. He no longer filled his calendar with meetings. Instead, he limited himself to 1 or 2 conversations a day. His doctors insisted on it. His body enforced it. But within those limits, Jonathan worked deliberately. He spoke again with Linda Perez, this time by phone, then again the following week. They talked not about donations, but about systems. About what happened when one nurse called in sick. About how a single broken imaging machine could delay dozens of diagnoses. About how exhaustion quietly eroded judgment long before mistakes appeared. Jonathan listened. He took notes. He asked questions that surprised even himself. Who decides what breaks first? He asked once. Linda sighed softly. Usually the people who can't afford for it not to. That answer stayed with him. At home, Margaret noticed the change before anyone else. Jonathan was quieter, more reflective. He no longer spoke in certainties. When he read the news, he didn't skim. He paused. "You're slowing down," she observed one evening. "I'm recalibrating," he replied. She smiled faintly. "You know, some people will say this is a phase." Jonathan nodded. "Some people always do." Annie visited again near the end of the second week. This time, Jonathan was able to meet her at the door himself, moving carefully but without assistance. Annie noticed immediately. "You're walking better," she said. "I've had good teachers," he replied. She stepped inside, carrying a small backpack. "I brought something," she announced. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. This drawing was different. It showed many hearts, all different sizes, connected by thin lines. "What's this one?" Jonathan asked. "It's everyone helping everyone," Annie said. "My teacher says that's how communities work." Jonathan looked at the drawing for a long moment. "Your teacher sounds wise." "She is," Annie said. "She lets us ask questions." Her mother watched quietly from the doorway, her expression thoughtful. They sat together at the kitchen table, Annie coloring while Jonathan rested. The conversation drifted easily. School stories, favorite snacks, the strange rules of spelling tests. At one point, Annie looked up. "Are you still sick?" she asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. "I'm healing," he said, "but I'll always have to be careful." She nodded, accepting this without drama. "My grandma has to be careful too." "Does she?" Jonathan asked. "Yes," Annie said. "She says careful doesn't mean scared." Jonathan smiled. "Your family is very good at words." After they left, Jonathan sat quietly with the drawings spread out before him. They formed a strange timeline: fear, connection, resolve, community. No spreadsheets, no projections, just intention made visible. Later that week, Jonathan agreed to a private meeting with 2 board members from the foundation. They came to the house, subdued, respectful. The conversation was tense but civil. "You're asking us to rethink our metrics," one of them said. "Yes," Jonathan replied. "You're asking us to invest in places with no naming opportunities, no immediate returns." "Yes. And you're prepared for resistance?" Jonathan met their gaze. "I'm prepared for honesty." The meeting ended without agreement. But it didn't end in dismissal either. That night, Jonathan slept deeply for the first time since returning home. The next morning, he woke with a clarity that felt earned. He asked Margaret to bring him his laptop. "I want to draft something," he said. "For the board?" she asked. "For myself," he replied. He wrote slowly, deliberately. Not a manifesto, not a promise. A framework. Principles he refused to compromise on, no matter how uncomfortable they made others. When he finished, he closed the laptop and rested his hands on it. "This isn't about redemption," he said aloud. Though no one was in the room, it was about alignment. That afternoon, Linda called again. "We had a meeting," she said. "Some of the staff heard you came by." Quietly, Jonathan braced himself. "And they're cautious," Linda said, "but hopeful, which doesn't happen often." Jonathan nodded. "I don't expect trust quickly." "Good," she replied, "because it takes consistency." Man. "I'm prepared for that," Jonathan said. When the call ended, he sat back, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, not pain, but reminder. Limits still applied, healing still demanded respect, but within those limits, something steady was taking shape. Not urgency, commitment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan stood by the window again, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Lights turned on one by one. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed. He placed Annie's newest drawing beside the others. Careful doesn't mean scared, he thought. It means awake. The invitation arrived on a plain sheet of paper, slipped quietly into Jonathan Hale's morning mail. No logos, no letterhead. Just a date, a time, and a location typed neatly at the top. Community Health Forum, East Side Neighborhood Center. Jonathan read it twice, then set it down carefully. "They want you to speak," Margaret said, reading over his shoulder. "They want me to listen," Jonathan replied. Margaret studied the page. Those aren't always the same thing. Jonathan nodded. That's why I need to go. His doctor hadn't loved the idea. Public spaces meant fatigue. Fatigue meant setbacks. But Jonathan had learned the difference between recklessness and intention. He wasn't chasing visibility. He was answering an invitation. The neighborhood center was nothing like the conference halls Jonathan used to frequent. The parking lot was uneven. The building low and wide, painted a faded blue that had clearly seen better years. Folding chairs filled the main room. A long table near the back held coffee in mismatched thermoses and a tray of store-bought cookies. Jonathan arrived early. He moved slowly, cane in hand, refusing offers to rush him inside. He wanted to see the place first. The children's drawings taped near the entrance, the bulletin board layered with flyers for free clinics, tutoring hours, food drives. Inside, people gathered in small clusters, nurses, parents, a few older men who watched him with guarded curiosity. No one clapped, no one whispered. They simply noticed him, then returned to their conversations. Linda Perez spotted him from across the room and approached. "You came," she said. "I said I would," Jonathan replied. She smiled faintly. "Some people thought you wouldn't. I understand why." Linda gestured toward the chairs. "We'll start soon. There's no stage. Just us." Jonathan nodded. "Good." When the meeting began, there were no introductions that listed achievements. Linda spoke briefly about the purpose of the forum, sharing concerns, ideas, frustrations. She did not mention Jonathan's name until the end. "And Mr. Hale is here," she said simply. "Not to present, just to hear." Jonathan stood slowly, the room quieting out of courtesy rather than expectation. "I won't take long," he said, "and I won't pretend to understand your lives. I'm here because I want to learn what I've ignored." No applause followed. That felt right. The first voice came from a nurse near the front. "We're tired," she said plainly. Not dramatic tired, bone tired, the kind that doesn't go away after a weekend. Another followed. "I wait 6 hours with my mom sometimes," a teenage boy said. "She gets scared when no one explains what's happening." A woman spoke next, her voice steady but tight. "My husband died waiting for a test that got delayed 3 times. I don't want money. I want answers." Jonathan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend systems he once benefited from. He took notes, his hand cramping, his chest tightening with effort and emotion. At one point, someone asked, "Why now?" The question cut through the room. Jonathan looked up slowly. "Because a child reminded me that silence is also a choice," he said, "and I've made it too often." No one argued. The meeting lasted longer than planned. Jonathan's energy waned, but he stayed. When he finally sat back, exhausted, Linda noticed immediately. "We're done," she announced gently. People stood, some nodding at Jonathan, others still cautious. A few approached him, not with gratitude, but with clarity. "Don't disappear," one man said. Jonathan met his gaze. "I won't." On the drive home, Jonathan leaned back, eyes closed, breathing carefully. "That took a lot out of you," Margaret said. "Yes," he replied. "But it gave me more than it took." At home, he rested for hours, his body insisting on stillness. When he woke, the sun was low, the room quiet. Annie's drawings lay on the side table, unchanged, constant. He reached for his phone and typed a short message to Linda. "Thank you for letting me be in the room." Her reply came quickly. "Thank you for staying." That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep, not from pain, from thinking. The forum hadn't offered solutions wrapped in neat proposals. It had offered something harder: accountability without applause. He understood now that whatever came next would not be clean or simple, but it would be real. In the early hours of the morning, Jonathan opened his laptop again. He reviewed his framework, the principles he had written days earlier. Then he added one more line at the top: presence before promises. He closed the laptop and sat back, listening to his heart steady, imperfect, awake. For the first time, Jonathan did not wonder how this story would end. He was focused on how it would continue. The announcement was not made from a podium. Jonathan Hale insisted on that. Instead, it began as a quiet letter, emailed, mailed, shared person to person, addressed not to investors or press outlets, but to employees, partners, hospital administrators, and community leaders who had learned to expect very little from statements that promised everything. The letter did not open with gratitude or self-reflection. It opened with acknowledgement. For years, I benefited from systems that worked well for people like me and failed quietly for many others. That single sentence unsettled more people than any grand pledge ever could. Margaret read it over his shoulder as Jonathan sat at the desk. Posture careful. Chest still tight from the previous week's exertion. "You're going to make some people angry," she said. Jonathan nodded. "I already have." He had spent days refining the language, stripping away anything that sounded performative or defensive. He refused to mention Annie by name. She was not a symbol. She was not a story to be leveraged. She was the reason he had stopped lying to himself, and that was enough. The response came quickly. Some messages were thoughtful, cautious, even grateful. Others were sharp, accusing him of overreach, of emotional decision-making, of destabilizing established partnerships. One message from a longtime associate stood out. "You're letting sentiment cloud judgment." Jonathan read it twice, then closed the laptop. "No," he said quietly to the empty room. "I'm letting judgment catch up to reality." The first tangible change followed a week later. Not a donation, a restructuring. Jonathan proposed redirecting a portion of the foundation's discretionary funds not toward new projects, but toward sustained operational support for underfunded public hospitals. No naming rights, no press releases, 5-year commitments reviewed annually by independent community boards. The resistance was immediate. "This is not how philanthropy works," one board member argued during a private call. Jonathan listened, then responded calmly. "That's exactly the problem. His doctors warned him not to push too hard. Stress could undo months of healing." Jonathan listened, but he did not retreat. He delegated more. He rested when he needed to. He learned, slowly, how to lead without dominating. Linda Perez called him late one afternoon. "They approved the pilot," she said, disbelief and relief mixed in her voice. Jonathan closed his eyes. "Which one?" "3 hospitals," she said. "Ours included." Jonathan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it settle not as triumph, but as responsibility. "That means accountability," he said. "Yes," Linda replied. "It does." Annie visited that weekend. She arrived with a new drawing tucked under her arm, but she didn't pull it out right away. Instead, she climbed onto the couch beside Jonathan, careful of his chest, and looked at him seriously. "My mom says you've been busy," she said. "I have," Jonathan admitted. "Busy, like tired busy?" Annie asked. "Yes," he said honestly. She nodded. "That's okay. Sometimes good things make you tired." Jonathan smiled. "You're very wise for 6. She shrugged. "My grandma says grown-ups forget things kids remember." "And what do kids remember?" Jonathan asked. Annie thought for a moment. Who helped when it was scary? That night, after Annie left, Jonathan stood by the window again. His strength had returned enough for short stretches without the cane. The city below felt closer now, less abstract. He received a call from the governor's office the next day. They wanted to meet, to discuss healthcare initiatives, to explore collaborative opportunities. Jonathan listened, then said carefully, "I'm not interested in optics." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We're interested in outcomes," the aide replied. "Then we can talk," Jonathan said. The meeting was scheduled quietly, without announcements. Jonathan attended with Linda and 2 representatives from community health organizations. He spoke less than expected. He asked questions that made the room uncomfortable. Who decides where funding stops? Who measures the cost of waiting? Who speaks for the people who never get the microphone? Afterward, Linda turned to him as they walked out. "You didn't play the role they expected," she said. Jonathan nodded. "I'm done playing roles." His recovery continued, uneven but steady. Some days he felt strong enough to forget his limitations. Other days reminded him sharply that healing was not linear. On one of those harder days, he found himself staring at Annie's drawings again. The many hearts connected by thin lines. The hospital with open hands. He realized something then. This wasn't about fixing everything. It was about refusing to accept silence as neutral. That evening, Jonathan added one final note to the framework he had written weeks earlier. If justice feels quiet, it's because it's working where no one is watching. He closed the notebook gently, as if sealing a promise. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, something had settled. Not certainty, commitment. The morning Jonathan Hale returned to the public hospital, no one recognized him at first. There were no cameras waiting, no aides clearing hallways, no announcement echoing through the building. He arrived the same way patients always did, slowly, carefully, leaning on a cane he no longer resented. The front desk clerk glanced up, nodded politely, and handed him a visitor badge without comment. Jonathan thanked her and moved on. That was how he wanted it. Linda Perez met him near the elevators. She looked tired, but there was something lighter in her expression than the last time they had spoken. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Jonathan replied. This time, they didn't tour rooms or sit in conference spaces. Linda led him instead to a small break room near the emergency wing. 2 nurses were there, drinking coffee. Mid-conversation, they stopped when Jonathan entered, uncertain. "This is Jonathan," Linda said simply. "He's here to listen." One of the nurses studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "Then listen to this." They talked for nearly an hour. About night shifts that never quite ended. About equipment that worked just well enough to avoid replacement. About moments of quiet dignity that made the exhaustion bearable. Jonathan didn't take notes this time. He didn't need to. Later, as he prepared to leave, a familiar small voice echoed down the hallway. "Mr. Jonathan, read it." He turned. Annie came running toward him, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She stopped just short of him, remembering his chest, and grinned. "You came back," she said. "I did," Jonathan replied. Her mother approached more slowly, offering a polite smile. "We were here for an appointment," she explained. Annie insisted on checking the waiting room first. Annie held out a folded piece of paper. "This one's the last one," she said. Jonathan opened it carefully. The drawing showed no hearts this time. Instead, it showed people. Many of them. Some tall, some small, some sitting, some helping others stand. No single figure was larger than the rest. "What is it?" Jonathan asked softly. "It's everyone," Annie said. "Together." Jonathan nodded, his throat tightening. "It's perfect." That afternoon, Jonathan sat on a bench outside the hospital, the city moving around him as it always had. The building behind him hummed with quiet urgency, unchanged and yet no longer invisible to him. Margaret joined him, handing him a bottle of water. "You okay?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "Tired, but the right kind." She smiled. "You know this won't be the end." "I know," he replied. "That's the point." In the weeks that followed, the work continued without fanfare. Funds were reallocated. Oversight committees formed. Community voices embedded where decisions were made. Some initiatives succeeded quickly, others stumbled. Jonathan accepted both outcomes without retreat. He no longer needed certainty to move forward. One evening, months later, Jonathan stood again by the window of his home. His cane rested unused against the wall. His chest still carried reminders, scar tissue, sensitivity, caution, but his heart beat strong and steady. Margaret joined him, holding a familiar stack of papers. "The board approved the expansion," she said. 5 more hospitals. That is a record. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "Good. And the governor's office wants a statement." Jonathan shook his head gently. "Let the work speak." Margaret studied him. "You've changed." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I hope so." On the table nearby, Annie's drawings lay neatly stacked. Jonathan picked up the first one, the heart drawn close so it wouldn't get lost. Then the others. Fear, healing, community. Finally, he placed the last drawing on top. Everyone, together. Jonathan understood now that his life had not been saved for a grand purpose. It had been saved for a simple one: to notice, to listen, to show up again. Somewhere across town, a little girl finished her homework and went to bed without knowing she had changed the direction of a man's life forever. And that was exactly how it should be. Because real change didn't announce itself. It stayed. This story reminds us that real change does not begin with power, money, or grand intentions. It begins with attention. A child with no authority, no status, and no expectations chose to act. And that single act exposed the quiet failures of systems adults had learned to accept. The lesson is simple but demanding. Justice is not always loud, and goodness is not always rewarded immediately. Often, it survives because someone small refuses to look away. For those with influence, the story is a warning and an invitation to listen before leading, to serve without spectacle, and to remember that responsibility does not end when the crisis passes. True integrity is not proven by what we claim to believe, but by whether we return, stay present, and keep showing up when no one is watching. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.